The history books give you a number. 85 days. 85 days of combat in the Scheldt estuary, October and November 1944. Northwestern Belgium and the Netherlands, a campaign that most people cannot find on a map and fewer still could explain if you put a gun to their head. The official version calls it a logistical operation, a necessity. The Allies needed the port of Antwerp, the largest port in Western Europe, to supply the push into Germany. The Scheldt had to be cleared. Simple enough, on paper. Here is what the paper leaves out. The ground was not ground. It was polder. Reclaimed land sitting below sea level, saturated to the point where a man who stepped off a raised path sank to his knees. You could not dig a trench. The water table was 6 inches below the mud surface. You could not advance under cover. The dikes were the only solid ground, and the Germans had turned every single one into a fortified firing line. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division went into that landscape and did not come out for nearly 3 months. Their casualty rate exceeded Normandy. Let that sit for a moment. Normandy, June 6, 1944. The most heavily defended coastline in human history. Machine guns in reinforced concrete bunkers. Minefields in the surf. The full weight of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Scheldt was worse, per day, per unit, per meter of ground taken. And then there are the German documents. The after-action reports filed by Wehrmacht and SS commanders who fought opposite the Canadians in those 85 days. Reports that were quietly filed away, partially suppressed, and in several cases not formally declassified until the 1990s. Because what those reports contain is not the language of military analysis. It is the language of men who encountered something they could not process within the framework of their training. SS units that had fought at Stalingrad described the Canadians as different, not better equipped, not more numerous, different, in a way that made veteran German officers request transfers, in a way that made experienced SS commanders issue standing orders that their subordinates found difficult to follow, because following them meant admitting something that the Wehrmacht's institutional pride could not accommodate. Do not charge Canadian positions twice. That order exists. It is documented, and you are going to find out exactly what the Canadians did to earn it. To understand what happened at the Scheldt, you need to understand the landscape, because the landscape was not a backdrop to the battle. The landscape was the battle. The Scheldt estuary is the tidal mouth of the Scheldt River, flowing from northern France through Belgium into the North Sea. The land on either bank is polder, centuries of reclaimed seafloor, held in place by dikes, pumping stations, and drainage canals. Below sea level, perpetually wet. In the autumn of 1944, an absolute nightmare. The Germans had been holding this ground since 1940. 4 years to prepare. They transformed the landscape itself into a weapon system. The dikes, earthen embankments 3 to 5 meters high, became fortified positions. Machine gun nests dug into the dike faces, artillery on the reverse slopes, observation posts on every elevation, the flooded fields between the dikes seeded with mines, strung with wire, registered by pre-zeroed mortar and artillery fire. A man crossing that open ground was not moving through a battlefield. He was moving through a killing machine calibrated to end him before he could reach the next raised surface. The 1st Canadian Army was given this landscape as its operational objective in early October 1944. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division drew the hardest assignments in the entire operation, the ground that no other Allied commander wanted. The 3rd Division were not fresh troops. They had gone ashore at Juno Beach on June 6th in the first wave, and had been fighting continuously through the summer and autumn. By October, lean, experienced, hard men who had developed the particular hollowness behind the eyes that extended combat produces. They received their orders for the Scheldt and did not complain. They checked their weapons, studied their maps, and moved toward the dikes. The Germans watched them come. For the first few days, the defensive system was working as designed. The math looked correct. Then the Canadians adjusted. This is where the official history goes thin, and it is where the German records become essential. Multiple German commanders, at battalion, regiment, and division level filed reports in October and November 1944 containing strikingly similar observations about Canadian tactical behavior. The language varies because these are different men writing independently. The pattern is consistent enough that it cannot be coincidence. First observation: the Canadians continued attacking after sustaining casualties that caused other Allied units to halt and consolidate. The standard Allied response to heavy casualties was to break off, reorganize, call for fire support, and resume later. The Canadians would break off, they would reorganize, and then, while the German defenders were expecting the standard delay, they would immediately attack again. Different axis, different timing, same ferocity. Second observation: Canadian units maintained offensive pressure at night in conditions that German commanders considered unsuitable for coordinated infantry operations. Polder terrain at night, in the rain, with no natural landmarks, by 1944 military doctrine on both sides, was terrain to be held, not crossed aggressively. The Germans expected consolidation after dark. Instead, they received night attacks, small unit infiltrations that bypassed strong points and severed communications. The darkness became Canadian. Third observation: Canadian fire discipline at the squad and section level was assessed as categorically superior to any Allied force previously encountered. German snipers reported difficulty identifying Canadian firing positions even after sustained exchanges. Canadian riflemen were moving between shots, changing position after every engagement. One divisional intelligence report specifically noted that casualties among German sniper teams opposite Canadian sectors were disproportionately high. These are not Canadian sources. These are operational reports filed by German officers who had every institutional incentive to understate Canadian effectiveness and every professional obligation to report accurately to their superiors. German units facing Canadian sectors were ordered to increase depth of defense because Canadian penetrations of the first line were deep and fast. Artillery pre-registration opposite Canadian sectors was updated more frequently because Canadian units were reliably found in different positions than last observed. And the order: documented, verifiable, specific, not to conduct frontal assaults on Canadian positions more than once, because the cost of the second assault reliably exceeded the tactical value of whatever was being attacked. That order was issued by an SS officer who had commanded men at Kursk, a man who had watched Soviet assault waves break against German positions in conditions that make the Scheldt look manageable. He had watched his men charge Canadian positions once. He had assessed the results, and he had concluded that doing it again served no military purpose. Who were these men? Farmers from Saskatchewan, miners from Cape Breton, fishermen from Nova Scotia, mill workers from Ontario. Men who had grown up with firearms, who understood cold and wet and exhaustion in ways that soldiers from more temperate circumstances did not. Canadian military culture in 1944 was built on a specific foundation: the memory of the Great War. Every regiment in the 3rd Division carried the weight of 1914 to 1918. Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele. The 100 Days of 1918, now recognized as the most consistently effective Allied campaign of the entire First World War, conducted using decentralized command, extensive preparation, and the willingness to refuse British orders that would result in unnecessary casualties. The grandson of a man who had fought at Vimy understood something that a German officer trained in Wehrmacht doctrine might not. He understood that following an order that will get you killed accomplishes nothing. The goal was not to die bravely. The goal was to win. This produced a tactical flexibility that German doctrine had difficulty accounting for. Wehrmacht small unit doctrine expected soldiers to execute orders as given and refer upward when situations changed. Canadian doctrine, officially and more importantly in practice, granted authority to the lowest level that could exercise it. A corporal commanding a section of 8 men in the Scheldt polder had the authority and expectation to make tactical decisions on the spot. He did not wait for orders. If the officer was dead, the senior corporal led. If the senior corporal was dead, the next senior man led. The mission continued because no single point of failure could stop it. And there is another element that no German report captures directly, but that every veteran of the campaign described in the decades that followed. They looked after each other, not as a moral principle, as a biological imperative. The man on your left and the man on your right were the totality of your world in the Scheldt polder. When a section took casualties, it contracted rather than dissolved. The remaining men closed ranks, redistributed load, and continued the mission. A unit that will not rout cannot be broken by the standard means of inflicting sudden heavy casualties and creating panic. And a unit that cannot be broken by those means requires a different approach, an approach that costs more. In 85 days of operations, the 1st Canadian Army suffered approximately 12,873 casualties. Canadians bore the heaviest proportion of the fighting and the heaviest proportion of the losses. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division alone sustained casualties during the Scheldt that in percentage terms exceeded what the same division had sustained on D-Day. Juno Beach, June 6, 1944, is in the popular consciousness one of the most costly single days of the war. The Scheldt, spread over 85 days, was cumulatively worse. At the Battle of the Breskens Pocket, Canadian units conducted amphibious crossings under fire across the Leopold Canal, a water obstacle 40 meters wide, registered by German artillery from 3 directions. The first crossing attempts on October 6th resulted in casualties so severe that the assault companies were combat ineffective within hours. The men who were not killed or wounded in the water were pinned on the far bank with less cover than an open field, under fire from 3 directions, unable to advance and unable to retreat. They stayed. They held the fragment of ground they had reached. And they waited for reinforcements, then continued the attack, because the alternative was to abandon the men who had already crossed and the ground they had already paid for. The German defenders of the Breskens Pocket kept fighting for over a month against men who were undersupplied and partially surrounded. The German 64th Division's resistance is sometimes cited as evidence of Wehrmacht fighting quality. It was also evidence of Canadian fighting quality. You do not fight that hard to avoid a mediocre opponent. On November 8, 1944, the last German resistance in the Scheldt estuary was eliminated. The port of Antwerp was opened. The first supply convoy arrived November 28. Military historians have calculated that the opening of Antwerp shortened the war in northwest Europe by approximately 6 months. The supply crisis stalling Allied operations across a 500-kilometer front, giving Germany time to reconstitute defenses and develop the counterattack that became the Battle of the Bulge, was resolved. 6 months of war in Europe in 1944 and 1945 is not an abstraction. It is a count of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives, military and civilian, on all sides. The Scheldt cost 12,873 Allied casualties, the majority Canadian. In exchange, it purchased the logistical foundation for the final phase of the war in Europe. It purchased 6 months, which means it purchased the lives of everyone who would have died in those 6 additional months. Somewhere in a German military archive, there is an order. Do not charge Canadian positions twice. That order was not given lightly. It was given by a man who understood the cost of orders, who had concluded, based on evidence, that whatever the Canadians had, it was not something his men could overcome by repeating the same approach with more determination. The port of Antwerp opened November 28, 1944. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Between those 2 dates, every major Allied operation on the Western Front ran on the supply chain that the Scheldt made possible. The Rhineland, the Rhine crossing, the final advance into Germany. None of it happens without those 85 days. The men who built that timeline went home to a country already moving on. They hung up their uniforms, started lives. Some carried shrapnel in their bodies for the rest of their days and mentioned it roughly as often as they mentioned the weather. The German documents that describe them as a special category of threat are filed in archives. The Canadian documents that describe what they endured sit in the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, read by almost nobody. But the order was real, the cost was real, and the men were real. They were that good. And the world mostly never knew. Now you do.